Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We'll give it just a couple minutes before we get our presentation started. We'll start in about just one more minute. We're just allowing a few people to join us. Okay, perfect. Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Cynthia Saturn here at the Foundation. Today, we are partnered with the Immigrant Legal Resource Center with a presentation on how recent changes to travel requirements will affect immigrants. And with us, we have Elizabeth and Veronica, who are also from Immigrant Legal Resource Center. And I'll go ahead and go over some housekeeping rules. So be mindful that this webinar is being recorded. We will share the presentation and the recording after the webinar. And then if you have any questions, please utilize the Q&A box throughout the webinar. And if we have any additional time at the end, we'll go over some questions in person. And then we will drop some resources and links throughout the presentation in the chat box. Other than that, I will go ahead and pass it to Liz and Vera and we can get started.
Thanks, Cynthia. Just real quick, hi everybody. I'm Liz from the ILRC, joined by Vero, as Cynthia said. We wanted to just go over some different updates. I think it will not escape anybody that there's a lot going on in the immigration world these days. And so we know that traveling, especially, since we just finished the holidays and whatnot, traveling is a topic that's on a lot of folks' mind. So we're going to go over just some updates around traveling domestically here in the States. I'm going to go over some international travel updates and then also go over how you can protect yourself when traveling, particularly in an international context. And then hopefully we'll have some time for questions. But as Cynthia said, please feel free to utilize the chat so we'll be able to see those and hopefully either respond there or respond in person. So for now, I will turn it over to Vero to get us started. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Liz. So I'm going to go over some updates for domestic travel as well as discuss some of the risks that people might face when traveling. We know that's a really big question right now around what documentation someone could use. What is the risk if they do decide to travel? What happens if you're traveling via air versus land? So I'm going to go over some of that with you all in today's presentation. Next slide. So what is considered domestic travel? This is just a review. I'm sure many of you already know this. So travel domestically is considered if you are doing any travel within the 50 states of the United States, right? Within the 50 states that we have. And this will include Hawaii and Alaska, right? So even if you are going to an island, it's still considered part of the United States. That would be domestic travel. You could also think of domestic travel as traveling to one of the U.S. territories like American Samoa, the U.S. Virgin Islands, and Puerto Rico, right? These are part of the U.S. Technically, even though they're not states, so that is still considered domestic travel. It's something to note, right, when traveling to these locations that are not part of the mainland, right? So when we think of mainland, we're thinking, you're in California and you could either get in a car and a plane and go to Texas, right? And as you pass, you're still passing other US territory. When you go to something not connected to the mainland, right, and you're flying, there is the possibility or the potential that there might be a layover in another country. For example, if you're going to Puerto Rico and you either look at a flight that might have a connecting flight in like the Dominican Republic, right? Or there's an emergency landing in another country, right? Like let's say, for example, again, the Dominican Republic, that would take you out of traveling domestic, right? Because now you're making that international stop. So it's important to take a look at that as you're planning your travel if you are considering that you're only traveling domestic. When we do domestic travel, the documentation and the status that you need to have will differ than when we're doing international travel, right? So traveling domestic, right, you have the ability to travel in essence, right, regardless of your status, though the risks differ, especially these days, but just something to keep in mind. Next slide. So what documents are needed to travel? What you will need is going to differ depending on whether you're flying there, right? You're doing air travel or you're going to drive there. Right now, as the laws say, right, in order to travel via air, you will need to have either a real ID, right? That law went into effect in May of having a real ID or a real ID approved document. If you don't have a real ID, you could use a US passport if you're a US citizen. You could use a trusted traveler card such as Global Entry, Nexus, Sentry, and FAS, right? If you are a green card holder or a lawful permanent resident, you could use your green card. That is an approved document that you could use to travel. If you have a boarding crossing card, you could use that. Or if you have work authorization, right, like an EAD related to DACA or TPS or asylum, you could use that. If you don't have any of this, you could technically use a foreign passport, right? These are all documents that are accepted in order to get and board a plane. And we'll discuss what it means to use these different documents depending on your status in a bit. If you are traveling by land, that's either by bus, by train, or you're driving. Generally, the documents that you would need is the photo identification. It's noted that to travel between cities, right, on a public bus or train, you would need that photo identification. If you're driving, right, you would need a license, and that could be either a real ID license or a non-real ID license to show that you are eligible to drive. Next slide. So what is the real ID? This is a review. Now it's been in effect for almost a year. The real ID, right, it's the law that established a minimum security standard for states' driver's license and identification cards. It went into effect last year. I know many people have now applied and have gotten a real ID for those of you who are eligible to get it. And this allows you to enter certain federal buildings, right? It allows you to board airplanes when you're doing that domestic travel, and it allows you to enter nuclear power plants. That should suffice, right? You should be able to show it, and that should allow you entry and the ability to pass, right, security checkpoints when you're at an airport. Next slide. Not everyone, unfortunately, is able to get a real ID, right? If you are applying, you have to make sure that you have the documentation needed in order to be eligible. Those who are able to apply for a real ID, right, are US citizens, green card holders or lawful permanent residents, and individuals with temporary status. These usually include people who have some sort of valid work permit, right, or they have that temporary status that they're able to be in the United States. This includes individuals who have DACA, right, or a type of deferred action like DACA, or through another benefit like a U visa, right? Those individuals also have the opportunity to obtain deferred action. If you have TPS or are a conditional resident or have a pending asylum application or a pending adjustment application, you could use that to get a real ID. Something to note for these temporary statuses is that your real ID would be issued for the amount of time that you have that status. So someone who has DACA would get their real ID for the 2 years that they're in valid DACA status. And we know that the state of California recently started recalling some IDs because they had issued them at times for longer than that temporary status, right? And people had to figure out how to, reapply or figure out why they received that letter, right? So something to look into if you were one of the ones who got that letter. But if you're in this temporary status, you could still obtain the real ID. Next slide. This is something new that will be going into effect, and this only pertains to air travel, right? So like I mentioned, for land travel, right, if you're driving, if you're on a bus, if you're doing train, you only need some sort of photo identifications in certain instances, right? Or if you're driving, you do need that driver's license to drive. If you are flying and you don't have a real ID, and let's say that you don't have one of the other accepted documentation. It was announced that there's going to be a new program starting February 1st of this year. So next week, it will go into effect where someone could apply right through TSA Confirm, the TSA Confirm ID program, pay $45 and be able to use that in order to board a plane or to pass TSA inspection. The idea of this is that someone would either go and do it online. So you would do it before you go to the airport, and you would be able to submit information, right? So like your legal name, when you are traveling, give them your information of how you're going to pay for it. And this would cover a 10-day trip, right? So if you are traveling longer than 10 days, you won't be able to use this. But essentially you would be able to apply for this, submit your information. And once you have the receipt notice, that receipt notice you will be able to take to the airport and show it at the TSA check, right? Where you go through security at an airport. What questions or what further inspection you will go at the airport, we will have to wait and see, right? So that they could approve you to go in to the airport, right? So they do note on the website, if you go and visit the website, that you have to allot more time because inspection will take longer than usual. Like if you were just going through with a real ID or one of the real ID approved documents. So give yourself more time. There might be some delay at the airport. We also don't know how many more questions, right, they will ask or what other information they will collect from you at that moment. So something to keep in mind. But we will see what else develops in this and give more information through some of our resources when we have it. Next slide. Okay. So those are the documentations that you would need in order to travel, right? So the question that we have gotten a lot and we've seen a lot from different community members and, you know, people who are seeking to travel is, what is A, your risk of travel, and B, what documents can you use to show that you could travel, right? So we went through the list of what documents are accepted. Here we provided a table of what documents you could use based on the status that you would have and what perceived risk you could have or what risk you have at this moment of this presentation, right? Things are changing rapidly. The way officials, you know, or the questions officials are doing at airports are changing every day. So it's important to review this, right? But also connect with someone if you are thinking of travel and you have questions about the risk or what could happen or what you could expect when you get to an airport. So here, you know, we've divided the information around documents that you would need to board a domestic air travel. So here we're thinking just air travel in that sense, right? What other documents you could use if you don't have a real ID or cannot access a real ID. And then also break down what could be the level of risk, right? And when we're thinking about risk, we're thinking risk of enforcement action being taken against you, right? Risk of being detained or being placed in removal proceedings, and what protections you might have. So if we look here, right, we start off with U.S. citizens, right? U.S. citizens are able to apply for the real ID. If they don't have a real ID, they're able to travel with their U.S. passport or a trusted traveler card. And the risk of enforcement when we're thinking of travel is relatively low, right? Or being questioned, detained by an officer at the moment seems low, right? Because, you know, U.S. citizens have a right to travel both domestically, internationally, right? And they have, they're outside of the enforcement spectrum for the most part, right? Going down the list, right, we have lawful permanent residents. Once again, they're also able to access the real ID, right? If they don't have that, they could use their green card to travel. Once again, the risk here is low, right? They have status. They're able to move, right, and be here in the United States, work, access different benefits. So they could consider, you know, they could travel, the risk should be low. If they are traveling and do have a real ID, consider traveling with that instead of your green card, right? You're supposed to carry your green card, right? But start off by showing your real ID. As we go down the list, right, thinking of someone who might have a pending application to become a green card holder, so someone who's going through the process here in the United States. They might already have a work authorization card, right, and their foreign passport. If they have that work authorization card, they could seek to get a real ID for the duration of their work authorization. If they don't have that, right, they could use the foreign passport. Here we foresee, because of enforcement, right, and how much protection someone might have, the risk here might be higher, right, for someone to travel, depending on when they're traveling, where they're traveling to. And so just something to consider, right, because someone, if they don't have any other status, right, they're technically out of status. So the questions that could be asked or the information or how someone could be held is different, right? So the risk could be higher. And then moving down the list, right, someone with refugee asylee status, right? If they are already an asylee or refugee, they have status, right? So the risk is lower, and they once again could either seek a real ID or use their work authorization to travel. Next slide. Here we have other forms of status, right? I'll just highlight a few. For example, DACA holders, right? They are able to access the real ID. If they have to travel domestically, it's recommended that they use the real ID to travel, right? Instead of their work authorization or their foreign passport. Here, the risk is low. Someone who has DACA is given deferred action, right? And protection from deportation, right? As long as your DACA is valid. We have heard of cases of DACA recipients having harsher interactions with officials at airports, right? So just something to consider. So it's important if you are traveling, you have questions to connect with a legal service provider just to discuss that before you travel. And then also just noting, another type of deferred action. So someone who has a U visa and a T visa, and they've been granted deferred action because the department thinks that your application will be approvable, but they just don't have a visa yet. Someone who has deferred action, once again, right, the risk is lower, right, lower to medium, right? You do not have status, right, but you do have protection from deportation at that moment. So that should afford you some level of protection when we're thinking about risks of removal and detention. Next slide. And then what if you don't have status? Can you travel domestically? Yes, right? You have the ability to travel. You just have to consider the risks, right? Because you aren't able to access a real ID. You do have to think through what documents you could use and what is the reason for traveling, where you're traveling for, to do that risk assessment for yourself. And also consider if you are, what airport you're going to and where are you in comparison to the border if you're doing land travel, just to make sure that you are able to assess at what points you might interact with immigration and what questions might be asked of you. Next slide. So here, just, breaking it down again towards documents that you could use and the risk associated, right? Someone who doesn't have benefit now or status now, the risk would be higher depending on when they're traveling or where they're traveling, right? But someone technically with a pending application or no application, right, it doesn't have another status. Domestic air travel could put someone at a higher risk for immigration enforcement and easier to identify because you are using that foreign passport, right? So it could lead to a line of questioning. And then just to note, someone who might have had previous contact with the immigration system that resulted in a removal order, there's also a higher risk because your information is already there, and there might be some enforcement action, right? And we have heard that TSA is providing passenger lists to ICE for immigration enforcement. So if you're in that position, it's really important to connect with someone before you travel. We understand sometimes people have to travel, but definitely have that point of contact before you do. Next slide. And then also take into consideration, like I mentioned, where you are traveling. Some states have friendlier immigration or sanctuary laws than others. Right here in California, we have broad sanctuary statutes. So cooperation between different entities and ICE could be limited compared to other states like Texas. So important to take that into consideration. And then just to note that the ILRC does have a state map on an immigration enforcement that you could take a look at, and you could see the different how the state entities interact with immigration enforcement if as you're thinking to travel to different locations, whether it's air or land travel. Next slide. And then lastly, for land travel, domestic ground travel, just remember that there's checkpoints as you get closer to the border. So it's, if you are driving somewhere or traveling somewhere with someone, as you're considering your risks or making your plan of travel, it's important to do the checkpoints, right? So thinking through the risks similarly as we did with air travel, right? What document can you use? What protection do you have from being detained or placed in removal proceedings? The advice or information there is similar, right? Where you are, what protection you have, and how far does that extend? Next slide. Okay. So I will leave it there and pass it to Liz to talk to us about international travel.
Thanks, Vero. So a lot of what Vero covered in the domestic travel space is pretty applicable in the international travel space as well. When we're talking about international travel, we're basically talking about two groups of folks. We're talking about those who need authorization to travel and return to the United States, and those who don't need it. And so in one category, we have US citizens and lawful permanent residents who do not need prior authorization in order to travel internationally and return to the United States, although there are more restrictions on lawful permanent residents or green card holders than there are on US citizens. And then there are other certain categories of folks with certain temporary statuses or with pending applications who can travel internationally, but only after seeking and being granted permission to leave the country and return. And then we have undocumented folks who don't have anything pending or anything who are not able to obtain permission from the United States government to travel internationally. Again, unless they have some sort of pending application that will qualify them for authorized travel. Next slide, please. So here's just a brief chart sort of going through whether or not authorization is needed to travel internationally based on the category of person with the status the person has. So US citizens obviously do not need prior permission from the government. They just need a US passport to be able to travel and go. They can stay outside of the United States as long as they want to. Lawful permanent residents or green card holders also do not need prior permission to leave the country and return. However, they do have to have a valid green card with them, and they also have to have valid travel documentation from a country where they have citizenship in order to travel. There are also temporal restrictions for lawful permanent residents, and by that I mean trips that are shorter than 6 months outside the country, usually not a problem. More than 6 months could become an issue, and for trips that are longer than a year could result in the abandonment of your green card or lawful permanent resident status. So just be mindful if you have a green card and you're traveling of how long you stay out of the country. And then we have folks that have applications um, for different things. So we have folks that have applications for lawful permanent residence. Again, those folks are able to apply for permission. In this case, it's called advanced parole. As we go through this, there's going to be different categories of travel authorization. One referred to as advanced parole, one is referred to just as travel authorization. Or like a refugee travel document for certain categories of folks. Those are distinct types of travel authorization, which is confusing because you apply for them on the same form. But we'll talk about the difference with parole and the other types of travel authorization in just a minute. Refugees and asylees, so folks that are in the United States that have refugee or asylee status may also apply to travel. Again, they need what's called a refugee travel document. Also, those who have pending asylum applications can also apply for a refugee travel document. Lawful permanent residents who adjusted status, they have a green card, and they were refugees or asylees before they got their green card, also have to apply for a refugee travel document. And then we have folks in temporary status like DACA or TPS or folks who have UNT visas who are also eligible to apply for either advanced parole or in the case of TPS holders, TPS travel authorization. But one note on UNT visa holders and U visa holders in particular, it is very difficult to get what the documentation you need for a U visa advanced parole. You have to get a stamp in your passport, which can be difficult. And advanced parole is not often given to U visa holders. So we don't really recommend that folks try to do it, especially in the current climate, but it is something that is available, just with not without a lot of dignity or difficulty, sorry. Next slide, please. A little bit more on lawful permanent residents. Remember, lawful permanent residents, including conditional lawful permanent residents, those are folks that have a green card that is good for 2 years, usually based on a marriage that wasn't long enough to get them the full green card at the time. Do have the right to travel internationally, and they do not have to ask permission ahead of time. But that does not mean that they have, the unlimited right to be out of the United States for as long as they want to. Trips, again, that are longer than 6 months may result in some secondary screening, some questions, some difficulty when returning. Trips that are longer than a year could result in a finding that the green card has been abandoned, and then that person would have a lot of difficulty either trying to get it back and maybe not being allowed back into the United States. Residents also have to travel with valid, unexpired paperwork from both the United States and their home country. And it's very likely, just based on on what we've seen in different spaces, is that it's very likely that returning off permanent residents may face more questioning, longer delays, and they should be prepared to answer questions about their trip, the same way that like maybe someone on DACA advanced parole would have to. And we'll talk about the questions that they ask and some that are permissible and which are impermissible a little bit later. We've also heard of some LPRs who maybe have some difficulties, either having to do with criminal history or the amount of time they were outside of the states, being encouraged by immigration officials to sign what's called a Form I-407, which would allow the person to voluntarily give up their LPR status and ostensibly return to the country to which they hold citizenship. So it's just really important to remember, and we'll get a little bit more into your rights at the airport when talking to immigration officials, that you should not sign anything that they give you without consulting an attorney, or if you know that it's something you already want to do. So that's just something to keep in mind as we go along. Next slide, please. So the other folks that are able to travel internationally but have to travel with authorization, meaning they had to apply for travel authorization before they left. That includes folks that again have DACA. DACA Advanced Parole is probably the biggest example of this category of folks. Also LPR applicants, so applicants that are applying for green cards can also apply for authorized travel. TPS also has its own travel authorization document. And then again, asylees, refugees, asylum applicants also may apply for travel documentation as well. We do hear that folks are continuing to apply for and be granted travel authorization, even though we're seeing them tear down a lot of the TPS designations, even though the future of DACA is very much up in the air. We are still seeing people that are applying for advanced parole for DACA, and they are traveling and returning, some without issue, some with maybe more screening, but eventually they're let back in. Reminder specifically for DACA advanced parole has very specific purposes. You have to show that you're leaving the country for urgent humanitarian, educational, or employment purposes. And so that may allow the immigration officials to ask you questions about your trip when you come back. But we'll get into that in a few slides as well. One note is that we are hearing reports that folks that are applying for emergency advanced parole are not receiving that, whereas that was not the practice maybe a year ago or so. But it is still being issued. It is still possible to travel, and the same with all of the other various travel authorizations, but we are seeing slower processing times, higher rates of denial. And so it's also just given the climate that we're in and the sort of heightened scrutiny on immigration applications as a whole. Before you apply for a travel permit, if you've not talked to an attorney or a DOJ accredited representative before you apply, you definitely should do that. And again, before you travel, you should speak to your attorney just to sort of assess the political climate, what's going on in policy, and to see if anything has changed. And this is all, with the caveat, obviously, that Sometimes travel is an emergency, and sometimes you don't have time to sit for that, but it is a good idea to try and get screened for these things before you apply, just to minimize your risk, or to help you sort of evaluate your personal risk with your own personal case. Next slide, please. Moving on to refugees and asylees. Again, these folks, refugees and asylees, asylum applicants, and also lawful permanent residents who were previously refugees or asylees, do have to apply for travel authorization if they want to. Again, refugees and asylees already have status in the United States, a refugee or asylee status. Asylum applicants are obviously folks that have an asylum application pending. These folks have to apply for a separate type of travel authorization called a refugee travel document, um, based on the assumption that no other country documentation is required or is available. So the basis of a refugee or asylum claim is that you've been persecuted by your home country. So it stands to reason that you cannot get travel documentation from that country when you want to travel outside the US. So once the refugee travel document is given to these folks, you don't have to have other documentation with you. You just take the travel document with you. One note of caution, though, if traveling on a refugee travel document, you should avoid travel to the country or countries of persecution that were listed on your asylum or refugee applications that could have really severe consequences for your immigration proceedings in the future, especially now while the government thinks that everything is fraud. They'll say, well, you said you were afraid to return to your home country, but you went back anyway, even though you went back, for, a day to visit your dying relative. They're still going to say, well, that shows that you're not afraid to return, and that could unravel the rest of your immigration experience. So just make sure you're cautious if that's the category in which you're traveling. Next slide, please. I did want to make one note. The reconciliation bill that passed in July implemented a new fee for parolees. So remember, I said a few slides back, there is a difference between travel authorization and advanced parole or parole of any kind. And this is one of the big differences at this point. The bill implemented what was $1,000 at the time of implementation. They've since raised it to $1,020. It is an additional fee for anyone who's paroled into the United States. And so that's anyone who's outside that's been paroled in under a humanitarian parole program. It's anybody already in the United States who's applying for a period of reparole or parole in place. And in this context, it applies to any travel authorization that is advanced parole. So for DACA recipients, for U visa, for different folks, if it is an advanced parole document that you have, you will pay the additional money when you return to the United States. So it is not paid at the time of the application. So when you file your application for advanced parole, you send in your regular application fees, which are right now $580 if you file it online, or $630 if you file it on paper. You would just go through the normal proceedings, and then once the advanced parole is granted and you leave and you return to the United States at the time you come in contact with CBP after you get off the plane, at that point you will be asked to pay $1,020 in order to gain entry to the United States. So again, that includes anyone who is traveling on advanced parole. It does not include others that are traveling on different types of authorization. Like if someone has a pending application for permanent residence, even though that's referred to as advanced parole, that's an exception to this rule, and also does not apply to folks that are traveling on TPS travel authorization or non-parole travel authorization, like the refugee travel documents, for example. So again, don't pay that $1,000, that $1,020 fee at the time you apply. You pay it after you get off the plane and you're trying to get back into the United States. Next slide, please. So now we're going to move into some law enforcement questions. Dealing with law enforcement at the airport, we're mostly going to be talking about Customs and Border Protection officers, CBP officers, because that's the majority of the folks that you're going to come in contact with in normal course of operations when you are traveling internationally. But the enforcement tactics are evolving pretty rapidly and pretty significantly. throughout all of the spaces in the United States, including the airports. So we're also going to be talking about some other law enforcement officers that you might come in contact with when you're at the airport, and just making sure that everyone has a good refresher on what your rights are and what the law enforcement authority is to search you and your belongings. Um, so we may not be able to answer all of the questions that might come up with this. This is an evolving space, but remember, we hope that what you'll take away from all of this is sort of a refresher on what your rights are, so that if you do find yourself in sort of a difficult situation at an airport with CBP agents, you are able to assert your rights and sort of stay calm and de-escalate the situation. Next slide, please. So just a couple of things. Vero mentioned some of this earlier. There are just higher levels of scrutiny across the immigration sphere right now. And at airports in particular, there are confirmed reports that the TSA, which is the Transportation Security Agency, I think, I don't know if that's what it stands for, but the folks that do the screenings are sharing information with ICE, specifically looking for those that have final removal orders, and then, working to make sure that ICE is able to apprehend those folks while they're in their airport. So these higher levels of data sharing through the various agencies can make it so that if you have something that's in your past, like a criminal history that wasn't previously reported on anything, or something along those lines, it can result in further enforcement at the airport. You may also have heard about some recent application pauses and visa bans and travel bans that have come out. And so if you're from one of those affected countries, and right now there are 40 countries that are affected by what we're calling a security-based visa ban, and application pauses at USCIS. That could throw kind of a wrench into your travel plans, first in getting travel authorization from USCIS, but also could just result in higher levels of scrutiny and vetting when you're traveling. So also just want to make sure if you've had any interaction at all with the criminal legal system since the last time you traveled, or since the last time you put in an application. So thinking for like green card holders, if you had any kind of criminal legal issue post getting your green card and you haven't been out of the country since then, you really should see an attorney and get a screening before you travel anywhere, just to make sure that you're, again, going through that individual risk assessment, which now includes, looking at your country of origin and what any kind of criminal conduct would be, and whether or not that's going to pose a risk for you when you try to come back into the country. Next slide, please. So just a real quick slide on who you might encounter at airports. Again, Customs and Border Protection, CBP officials, probably the main folks that you're going to see. Those are the folks that when you're coming back, you're returning to the United States after a trip abroad. Those are the folks that are going to, initially look at your passport and, decide and verify your identity and either wave you through or send you on to the next round of screening. We'll talk about that in a little bit. You might also see some Homeland Security investigation officials. They investigate a lot of different crimes, including like trafficking and drug smuggling and that sort of thing. But there may be an increased presence depending on what's going on that day, or whether or not they just are flooding more immigration officials to the different airports. You might find FBI agents too. Again, not typically involved in the immigration screening process, but as there is more collusion between the different federal agencies, you never know what someone's doing there. But FBI is routinely at the airports, again, focusing usually around some sort of criminal investigation or something along those lines. And then you might also see other law enforcement officials, local police, other federal agents, who are doing an investigation, something along those lines. The other group of folks that you'll see for sure are the Transportation Security Administration. That's what TSA stands for. Who are the folks that do the screening and security. It's important that the distinction here is that these are not law enforcement officers. They don't have the ability to arrest you. They're there to just screen and look for different things in your backpack, and make sure you don't bring any water in or anything like that. But given the fact that there is a decent amount of data sharing going on, the interaction with TSA could lead to your interaction with another immigration enforcement entity. Next slide, please. So just a quick roundup of the difference between primary and secondary inspection. Primary inspection, again, this is with CBP, is what we all go through. It's the first round of inspection where you hand over your passport and they kind of look to see, they want to assess your identity, citizenship, whether or not you have the proper documentation to enter the US. They'll, ask you if you've got any sort of banned fruits and vegetables, you've got too much cash, that sort of thing. And then also screen for any violations. So if they have any information, again, through data sharing, that when they run your information, that might pop up, that's when they're going to do that. And then after primary inspection, they'll either allow you entry to the United States or they'll send you what that's called secondary inspection. And so that's where we might see the CBP officers asking more in-depth questions, doing a more thorough screening of the person that they're inspecting. So they may ask about any kind of issues with your documentation or information, ask information about immigration violations, violation of civil or criminal laws. They could do a random screening too, like sometimes you could just get sent to secondary. Do a primary inspection. Officer believes that there needs to be some more screening, like they need to ask you some more questions, but there's a line, so they want to move you to secondary and have somebody else ask you some questions. Or if there's any other issue, it's a pretty broad discretion to be able to do that. This is usually where they're going to ask you more questions about where you traveled and what you did there. So again, this primarily should be CBP officers that are there, but there's also a possibility that other law enforcement could be present. Next slide, please. So here's a list of questions that are permissible for CBP to ask. They have the right to ask about, who you are and whether or not you're authorized to come into the country. So they can ask you for your identification. They can ask you about your immigration status, but especially if you are in uncertain immigration status, you might want to assert your right to remain silent here. They can ask you about your trip, the trip you just went on. They can ask you about the purpose, itinerary, destination, duration, especially if you're traveling on something like advanced parole and you wrote down all of the purposes and the expected duration of your trip in your application. They may be looking to make sure that that matches what they have. Again, they can ask you about things like fruit, food or fruits that you're not supposed to bring in, or if you're carrying a lot of cash. They can ask you about your email, phone number, and address. Again, this might be a place where, depending on your own risk assessment, your own risk aversion, your own personal situation and immigration status, you may want to assert your right to remain silent about that. And they can ask about your occupation, especially if you're traveling on, if you are traveling on business travel, or if you're a student, something along those lines, they might be able to ask you about that. But again, you may want to remain silent depending on what your occupation is. Say if you are an attorney for a progressive immigrant advocacy organization, you may not want to explain that at CBP. One of the things that on the other side is a list of things that they really cannot ask you about. And again, these are questions that we advise you to assert your right to remain silent if you think that it will trigger something else for you. So again, you need to, as thinking about this, you really need to think about your own aversion to risk and whether or not you're, you have an immigration status that would make things easier for you to either assert your right to remain silent or answer the questions. It's really a very personal discussion. So they can't ask you about how you planned your trip. They can't ask who planned the trip or helped you plan. They cannot ask you about future travel plans or any future plans at any kind. They can't ask you who you spent your time with during your trip. Again, for DACA AP, if you said, well, I went to, go to my grandmother's funeral, they're going to ask you, did you go to a funeral and did you spend time with your family, that sort of thing. So you might want to have to answer that one. They can't ask you about your politics, current events, or your religion, and they can't ask you about your social media accounts, even though they think they can. You can assert your right to remain silent about that. But just keep in mind that CBP does think they have the right to ask you about your social media accounts, but it could be a violation of your First Amendment rights, and you are within your rights to remain silent when they ask about that. And remember, whatever you do, remaining silent and providing false information are two different things. So you will have the right to remain silent. You do not have the right to provide false information. Next slide, please. And this is just a quick example of what you can say when CBP starts asking you questions that are not permissible for them. You can say, happy to answer questions about my current trip and some questions about myself, but I don't feel comfortable answering any other questions without a lawyer present. Or you can just simply say, I'm asserting my right to remain silent. Repetition is key. They're very persistent. They may ask you a whole bunch of times. So if you decide to go down the road of remaining silent, which is your right to do, make sure you stick to it. And you may have to say, I am asserting my right to remain silent multiple times. So just keep that in mind as well. Next slide, please. So again, if you are going to, whether or not you're going to answer CBP's questions, even if they're impermissible questions, that is a personal decision that you have to make based on your own situation. So you're a U.S. citizen, you might feel like, yeah, I can answer these because U.S. citizens can't be denied entry to the United States. You might slow you down. It might be confrontational. It might be really unpleasant. But at the end of the day, if you are a U.S. citizen, they have to let you in. So you can decide whether or not you want to answer those questions. Green card holders, it could result in travel delays, further questioning. They really can't deny you entry without having a reason. So if you've been out of the United States for 2 years, then they might have a cause to push you into some more problems. But they could pressure you to sign a form to abandon your legal status. Even if you haven't been out of the country that long, they might still try to get you to abandon your status. But they can't refuse you entry unless you engaged in some sort of criminal legal activity or like conviction for a controlled substance, or unless you were out of the country for a really long time. There is always a risk, though, that you could end up in removal proceedings with that. So just keep that in mind. If all you have is a visa, even like a student visa or multiple entry visa, refusal to answer the questions could result in you being denied entry to the United States. There is a way, and if that's the case, they will try to return you to your country of origin. So if you have a fear of persecution in your country of origin, you need to make sure that you let that fact be known, before they can put you on a plane. And then non-visa holders, undocumented individuals, folks that are traveling internally, you'd still have the right to remain silent, but it could result in further immigration enforcement, arrest, detention. And if you're arrested, again, same thing. If you have a fear of persecution in your home country, you should definitely make sure that someone knows that. And you should also ask to speak to a lawyer if you are arrested and detained. And again, your right to remain silent does not go with your immigration status. You have the right to remain silent no matter who you are. So I know we're running a little short on time, so I'm going to turn it back over to Vero, I think. Oh, wait, no, I have one more slide. Sorry. Next slide, please. And again, your rights, you have rights even if you refuse to respond. You have the right to remain silent. You have the right not to sign anything, even if a form is presented to you that they say you have to sign it. No, you don't. And if a form is presented to you in a language that you do not understand, you have the right to ask for a translation. You also have the right to ask for an attorney. They likely will not give you an attorney in CBP custody, but you have the right to ask for it. And also make sure that you have your reg card with you. The ILRC reg card website is right there. You can print them and make them yourself, but make sure you have one with you at all times. All right, now I'm going to turn it back over to Vero to talk about searches.
Thanks, Liz. So I'm going to talk about searches at the airport, in particular around, your person, right, and your stuff, and then our electronic devices. I'm going to go a bit quickly through these slides because I do want to leave some time at the end for us to discuss some of your questions that have been coming in the chat box before we close. So just generally, right, CBP officers or other airport officials, they may, right, search your belongings for contraband, even if they don't have suspicion of any wrongdoing, right? We all have to go through TSA security, right? They go through our bags, they scan us, right, to make sure we don't have anything on our person. They could either send you through a body scan or pat you down. And if you opt for a pat down, you do have a right to request to do it in a private area, to have somebody accompany you in that area, and then to pick the officer of your gender preference. In this situation, right? officers can, right, do strip searches of individuals, but they have to have reasonable suspicion that you are involved in a criminal activity, right? They can't just do it for the sake of doing it. They have to give you a reason for it, right? And then it's important to note that they cannot just select someone, right, to further search someone just because of their race, religion, national origin, gender, ethnicity, or political beliefs, right? Though we see things play out on the ground a little different, right? People who are held longer at security checkpoints, but technically they're not allowed. Next slide. When it comes to our electronic devices, CBP claims that they have the right and the authority to search our electronic devices, right? We often don't want to give them the right to do that, right? Or allow them to do that, or hand it over just because they asked us. Because our cell phones and our devices carry a lot of information that we might not want to share with them. Even though they claim that they have the authority, right? Legal experts disagree, right? We think that they need a warrant or something, some reasonable suspicion to tell you that they need your device. This is still an ongoing legal issue, right? So things are developing, and as we're seeing more individuals be stopped and more devices be confiscated by CBP, we'll probably see more development in this area, and where the courts land, right? Whether they have to have a warrant, whether they have to, right, give you reasonable suspicion of any activity, right, in order to seek your devices. There is a directive, right, a CBP directive that distinguishes between them doing a basic search and an advanced search of your device, right? So it's something to note and take a look at around what they consider basic and what they consider advanced. Something to note, right? A basic search entails an officer just reviewing the contents of your device manually without any external assistance. And an advanced search entails them connecting the device to an external equipment to not only gain access, but to review, copy, and analyze its contents, right? So they're taking what's there. For this, right, it's important to push back, right? There should be limits on this. And the directive does speak to how privileged information or sensitive information should be separated, right? So if you are someone traveling, for example, a legal advocate, and you have attorney-client privilege or some sort of privilege on your phone, there should be some protection to what information they should be able to access. Next slide. Once again, when deciding, whether or not to give them access to your phone, it's going to depend again on your status, right? And what your risks are of being denied entry if you don't give them your phone, right? And if you don't cooperate in that situation. US citizens cannot be denied entry, right? CBP cannot deny entry of US citizens into the United States, but they could confiscate their electronic devices. For green card holders, right, or LPRs, it's important to note that CBP cannot deny entry for most lawful permanent residents unless they meet 6 exceptions, right? Like, for example, they engaged in some illegal activity that could make them deportable, or they've been out of the country for more than 6 months, right? Then it changes, but generally they cannot deny entry. And also CBP officers cannot take someone's status away from them, right? A green card holder. It's not like a CBP officer could say you're no longer a green card holder. Only a judge could do that, but they could confiscate the device. For non-citizen visa holders, right, like tourists, individuals coming on a tourist visa, CBP officials can deny them entry, right? They have a right to review and decide whether someone could come in or not. And then non-visa holders and documented individuals, right, that could lead to further questioning and or arrest and detention, right, depending on the situation. If your electronic device is searched or confiscated, it's important to ask for a receipt and get as much information as possible about the officer, like the agency name, batch number, email, etc., so that you are able to record what happened. And if you have some way to push back and or bring any action against them for what they did, right, it's important to have a record of that. Next slide. Just, quickly to note, right, there is such a thing as a no-fly or national security list, right, where individuals could be denied, the ability to board a plane or to travel by air. If someone is targeted and they think that it's wrong for them to be on the list, right? It's an error. You could submit an inquiry through DHS, through their travel redress inquiry program, and figure out why you're there on the list. In addition to this, you could also request information or make an inquiry. Um, if you are either denied or delayed airline boarding, right? Denied or delayed entry into and exit from the US, right? Or are in situations where travelers believe they face screening problems at port of entry. So you could question and get information about what's happening there. Next slide. And then if you are traveling, something important to do before you travel, right, as things get a bit more complicated in different situations, it's important to create a travel preparedness plan, right? So make a checklist of any necessary documents you might need. Also, it's important to do a research, right, of current immigration enforcement trends and landscapes as things are changing rapidly, right? And we're seeing that there's large enforcement in different cities throughout the United States, right? So thinking about your traveling and what's happening there and how officers are acting in certain cities compared to others. Have your identification ready, right? And know what your identification gives you the right to do and not do in certain situation, or what protections you get. If you have any type of legal status, make sure you have proof of that legal status, right? In case it's questioned, the real ID should suffice to show that you have the ability to travel and you are in the United States with some sort of status, right? Because you're only able to get it if you have it. Go over your digital hygiene tips, right? So make sure that if you have anything on your phone that you don't want to risk giving access to CBP, that you clean it, that maybe you change your how you access your phone, or how you're going to have it either on or off in certain situations, right? So make sure of that. And then consider safety planning, right? So have emergency contact numbers in case the worst happens, right? We hope that it doesn't, but in case the worst happens, make sure that you have that plan in place, who you will contact, who you could contact, who has access to any other documents that might be of use if you are detained or face any sort of enforcement. Next slide. And then just, some general digital hygiene before you travel. We are in an age where we depend a lot on our phones and our devices, right? Most of us travel with our smartphones, and our smartphones have our wallets, our IDs, our emails, right? Our social media. If you are traveling and you are concerned, right? This is especially like international travel, think about backing up or storing the important information from your device. Maybe only travel with necessary devices, right? So if you do have, for example, a work phone and a personal phone, maybe you don't take your work phone because that has a lot of information about what you do with clients and or other advocates and for school. Consider changing the settings on your phone from biometrics, right? So being a face scan to a strong passcode, right? Because then it's harder for people to gain access without your consent. And then also consider maybe having your phone off or in airplane mode as you go through different checkpoints at the airport, so that it's not as easily accessible. And then also, we know some people have considered recently using burner phones or secondary phones when traveling abroad, particularly just to secure their information a bit more. And then, as always, remember that you have a right to assert privileged information, right? And let the officers know. And you always have a right to assert your rights, right? Our rights have not changed, despite what some entities might think. We still have rights. And it's important to assert those and push back. So I'm going to, next slide. We're going to skip the skid and because of time, and maybe we'll see if there's any questions we want to answer out loud before we end today.
I do see one that's repeated a couple of times. Whether you can, if you're an LPR and you are traveling and you have to, you have a renewal, or if you have a like an I-90 or something, like if you have an EAD or something that's expiring and you've applied to have it renewed, but is it enough to travel with just the USCIS receipt and the expired or expiring card as well? So that's a good, a good example of that is an LPR whose green card is expired, but they have applied to renew it. What do you think, Vero?
Technically, yes, right? It should be enough for you to travel with your expired green card and the receipt notice saying that you have an extension of that green card because you're in the process um, of renewing, but things are changing rapidly, right? And what's noted on receipt notice is sometimes it's also changing. And I think it will also depend on whether you're doing air travel or land travel, right? So at a border, right, crossing by land, it might be enough to show that versus like on an airplane, you might also have to show your passport that you have. But technically, yes, you can. I mean, if you're worried, you could also apply to get a stamp in your passport. It's escaping me right now what it's called, Liz. I don't know if you know. That green card holder. Sorry about that. But you could also apply to get that stamp in your passport and then use that to also travel. If you're outside the country and your green card has expired and you still haven't renewed, you will be asked to pay a fee, right? But they can't deny your entry, right? But you will have to pay a fee to enter the United States again.
I also see some things talking about traveling to Puerto Rico and whether or not that is, 'cause since that is technically the United States is technically domestic travel, whether there are risks. And I think that there are. I think somebody pointed out that you could be in contact with CBP in traveling in the same way, but again, it is Puerto Rico should be considered the same as Hawaii or Alaska, which you can drive to Alaska if you want to, but you have to fly to Hawaii, so it should be the same. It should still fall within the domestic air travel space.
Yeah, and just to add, it just gets scarier because you are going right somewhere else. So I think it's definitely important to have that conversation before you travel, if you're going to Puerto Rico or the US Virgin Islands. And then also, it has been noted that at times CBP is more present in some of this like travel than just like, for example, traveling from California to Colorado, right? So just something to keep in mind as you're traveling.
And it's an I-551 aided stamp. Thank you, Amy.
Thank you, Amy.
I could not have brought that out of my head today.
So, any other question we want to highlight before we end? I know we are now.
There's a question about, I know that we're over time, about using bus depots and train stations. My inclination is to say it's the same. Your rights are the same no matter what. But the domestic travel, tips and whatnot that Vero took us through definitely apply in the bus and the depot as well. I think the main difference there is that, if there are checkpoints, the bus is going to stop for the checkpoints and, they're going to allow access to immigration officials if that's something that they want to do, depending on the bus or train. But I don't know if you've got any other thoughts about that, Gretel.
Yeah, no, that's right. And I think it's also going to depend how close you get to the border, right? Because when you're 100 miles from a border, CBP could just board a bus, right, and ask questions. So it's important to take that into consideration. People generally see land travel as a bit safer because at airports we know, right, that it's technically a border. There's officials, right? CBP could be present, DHS could be present, and maybe that won't be the case depending on where you're traveling by land.
Okay, I think we're out of time. Right, Cynthia?
Yeah. Well, thank you, Liz. Thank you, Vero. We will go ahead and close out this webinar. We will send the presentation and recording sometime next week, and we'll try to gather all the questions that have been unanswered, and hopefully we can get that out to you all. But thank you all for joining us today. Have a wonderful day.